Here is a quick tutorial on how to edit or just check the different parts of the SteamVR input. You come here to Windows, or just Window, and hit SteamVR Input, and then you have action sets. And there's multiple ones. The platform, buggy, and mixed reality ones are from some of the sample scenes and stuff and such that SteamVR provides. Default is something that everything can kind of use. I just edited default and added interact UI and reset camera. Originally, I was just reusing trigger, but I felt that having some canonical name for specifically what we're doing in the app was better, and it'd be easier to find them in other controllers. So yeah, that's what I did. It's just called interact UI and reset camera. If you want to add anything, you just hit plus, and then you give it a name, and then you give it a localized string name, which is just the name itself will be used in code for looking up the control, and then this localized string just helps you. It's used inside this binding UI. So this one you'll have like spaces and you can have punctuation or whatever. This one you should probably just keep it a normal what is it, camel case? Yeah, normal camel case pattern. This one, don't worry about punctuation. There's also a required part. You can also change the types. Generally, you're probably just going to be using booleans for buttons, but you might use a vector 1 or 2 if you're doing something like trying to find how far the trigger's pulled down or something like that, or for vector 2 like a d-pad. But we're just going to do boolean, or that's what I did for these. There is a required part, and then for interact UI and reset camera I set to mandatory because you have to have those for the app to really work. Technically reset camera is not necessary, but I kind of rather force it to be mandatory. That way if the player actually decides to try and rebind key controls using SteamVR, which they can in fact do, it makes sure that they correctly rebind these. These other ones, all these are optional, suggested, I'm pretty sure. But let's just delete this since we're not using it. But let's go ahead and open this, and this is the really important part. One thing I didn't realize was that this is actually a button. Whenever I first did this, I thought I was just picking up, the current controller that's being used with SteamVR, but in fact, no, you can select which ones you want. It does actually default to the current controller you're using, but you can switch from Index to Oculus or the Vive controller, which is very useful if you want to get it working for other controllers. So in here, you can add a new binding by hitting the plus. Originally, I didn't realize you could add multiple bindings, so this is very useful. So for the trigger, it has just a normal trigger name, that event, I guess you could call it, that gets lack for a better word, triggered. There's an event called trigger that gets triggered whenever you pull the trigger. It's kind of a weird way to put things, just because the name is kind of synonymous with or the noun is synonymous with the verb. But a better way to put it is whenever the trigger is pulled, it sends an event called interact UI, and you can read this. That's just kind of a simplification of everything. It'll also tell you whenever it's first pressed, while it's being pressed, and then released, and then some other stuff, I'm sure. But basically, you can add more than one binding to a single input mechanism like the trigger. All you do is hit plus, like I was saying. You can do trigger or you can do button. These are the type of input. Generally I do button. I'm not sure what the difference between trigger and button is. Actually, I think trigger is a vector 1, so it'll give you a 0 to 1 value, like a float, 0 to 1. But you just add button, and then you decide which sort of a event name you want to do. And then, for this one I did interact UI, and you just do that. Since we already have that, we'll delete it. Oh, and one thing, make sure you hit this little check mark. But yeah, we'll delete that. And then I did the same thing for the B button. I just did another button. Under click, I did reset camera. Click is just whenever the button's fully engaged down. Touch is whenever the player just brushes the button itself. It's part of like the different sensors in the Knuckles controllers. Not all controllers have the touch. So we're going to delete that. But yeah, that's how you come in here and edit it. Now once you finally finish doing what you're doing, you hit replace default binding. Don't worry about the name or the description, just hit save. It'll save over it. And then if you come back to Unity, you just do save and generate. And then you're good to go. You just close this and then it should work. And then back to like what I was saying with the controllers. Let's just reopen these. You can choose another controller. Let's go to the Vive controller. Here it is. It's already set up for the trigger. I have Interact UI on there. And then, where is it? For the menu, I did reset camera, since there's no B button. I felt like that was the best one to do. And then, if you're going to edit this, replace default binding. Okay, we're going to go back. And then Oculus controller. Click edit. And then this one is kind of a weird one. And I found that this mirror mode's kind of buggy. But basically, on trigger, I put Interact UI. And then on the Y button, I put Reset Camera. The Y is basically the same as the B button on the Valve Index. So that's why I chose that one. But as you notice, the right controller has a B button. In fact, it has A and B instead of X and Y. So for the right controller, I want B to be the reset camera so that both controllers can, reset the camera. Well, you have to turn off mirror mode to do that. And then I added, here to the B button. Whenever you hit, or if you turn the mirror mode back on, it'll clear this binding. Even though a second ago it wasn't even accessible till I turned off the mirror mode. That's a bug. It's quite annoying. But let's just rebind it back. Reset camera. Click the check. Don't forget the check. And then replace default binding. And there we go. We've got it set up for Oculus. So just go back. We already did this for everything. We already did index. So I'll just close that. And then save and generate. Now if you want, you can end up making your own action set, but I decided not to do this for in the case that the player decides to rebind some controls. They're not going to know which one's which, so they're just going to assume that the action set default is the one they need to be rebinding. If I put something like, originally I was going to put one called CMV, but that just doesn't make any sense to the player. They won't know that that means that's the one for this app, especially if the app at some point gets renamed from CADModelViewer. I just call it CMV for short. But yeah, they wouldn't know that. Okay, and then I also wanted to show, if you're having any issues with that, you can actually debug what's actually happening. So you have to open this little live view from the same Windows SteamVR section, and you start the app. found that any doesn't really tell you much. It's also really hard to see what it's saying because of my color for the editor. Close that. So yep, it's working. Whenever I pull the trigger down, it says true. It's really hard to see, but it's saying true. And then also for the Interact UI, it's also saying true. And then reset camera, I'm going to hit B. Yep, that works. So that's a good way to debug things. You can also see that B is also being set. So yeah, that's one way to debug things. And then finally, just back over to the code. To get the actual SteamVR action, you just do SteamVR Input, get action, and then you give it a SteamVR action Boolean type, which is just, you know, equivalent to a button. I think actually there is some documentation. Okay, here I found it. It's just in the SteamVR directory, the root one, not the SteamVR Input or resources, just the main SteamVR root directory. Down here, SteamVR Unity plugin input system. Here we are. And then, yeah, it'll tell you about the different actions. Yeah. Single's a vector 2. Boolean is just true or false, so that'd be akin to a button. There's some other stuff in here. It talks about action sets and stuff like that. But let's go back to the code. So yeah, we got SteamVR action Boolean. Before, I was just searching by the name, and then I thought there was an issue with that, but I accidentally misspelled reset camera. I accidentally spelled it camera reset, and it was giving me an error. And I thought it was not finding the right action set or something. So I added the action set, but you don't actually have to do that. You can just do this, and that should work, but I'm going to leave it like that just to be proper. But yeah, you just give it an action set name and an action name, and then you can read from it. Now, the way I have the input set up, I use an input action button type that I created myself. And on the construction of an input action button, you have to give it a delegate that it calls that just gets the state of the input action. And to do that, you just call on the SteamVR action Boolean. You just do get state, and then you pass in an input source, and then get the value back out of it. The input source itself is an enum, but I did a I can't remember what it's called, but it's you add a question mark on the end of the type, and then it allows you to set something to null that normally wouldn't be allowed to set to null. So like an enum, you can't set it to null, you have to give it a value. So I use this question mark on the end of here. So now you have it encapsulates that enum inside of some like special class or struct, and you have to reference the value part, and that'll get the value stored inside of the actual variable. If you do dot value and there's no value in here, I think it'll throw an error. But here I am checking if it's not equal to null, whether I'll actually set up these actions. But yeah, it's just interact UI action grabs the state. This delegate is called every time, or it's called every frame, I believe, to determine whether, you know, this is if you're entering this action or you're inside of the action, or you're exiting said action. You can see all that just from the source code here. And we're not going to go into this, but basically there's a start, active, and end state. I said exit earlier, but I think I called it, oh no, I call it cancel instead of exit. There's a start, active, and cancel phase. And then if we go to the input module for SteamVR, we can take a little bit more look at it. Right controller interact UI action on start. I give it a process press of the right controller. Right controller is like a static instance of the right controller. But this is just the way I handle things. On the start, process press is like, you know, processing a left click if you're just doing normal UI. But since we're doing, you know, 3D stuff with VR, it'll send out a raycast from the controller and then interact with whatever it hits, and that's what this process press is doing. And then the process release is handling whatever you let go. And then for the camera reset, just on start, for the right and the left controller here, it resets the transform. And then there's just some debug messages whenever you release. Don't need those anymore, really. But yeah, that's just a quick overview on how to update inputs and sort of add new stuff. So yeah.